Sweet dreams are made of this.
Backstory for relevance. This story takes place between the ages of 18 and 24, before I moved away from the area. Small town in southern Kentucky. There's nothing to do. A friend and I were always adventurous, so it's either get into shit or do meth. We never got into meth. Our most common pastime was driving back roads at night and listening to music. The second being going out into the woods and caving. Way the hell out in the country, basically middle of nowhere. No cell service once you get this far out. We were 19 at the time. Sometimes we'd check out supposedly haunted locations, but this was not one of those nights. Nothing ever happened on those nights anyways. That night was just a regular let's drive around the boonies kind of night. It was fall, around 2 a.m. We decided to go down this particularly small, easily missed road that we've been to multiple times both day and night. It goes down and in the middle of the woods, and at the end is actually a freshly paved parking lot and a more modern built small church. It's kind of odd because it's just like, why? There's no creep factor at all to the church itself, no dumb local stories. It's just a church and the country people used it. Before you get to the lot there's a spring and the shortest concrete bridge ever that you drive over. Our idea was to park the car and chill on the bridge. However, when we came around the bend and the bridge was immediately in sight, a large, tall man was standing dead center of it. Dude was disheveled, no shoes, dirty, and had tattered overalls on. Like, think mountainous feral hillbilly, and you've got it. Last thing we expected to see all the way out there at 2 a.m. It scared the hell out of us. This guy's reaction was to jump down and scramble up underneath the bridge. There was nowhere to turn around before the bridge, so we had to speed over it, into the lot, and speed out of there. There's nothing paranormal to this story, and it's probably just some weird-ass mountain hillbilly, but goddamn if that's not the most unsettling thing to see in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. When I was 8 or 9 years old, a group of 5 of us had a sleepover at a friend's house for his birthday. The friend lived on a farm with a number of barns. There was one barn in particular that we would play in. It backed up to a densely wooded area. My friend's family had 2 large German shepherds, but we would only be around them if his parents were around, given their size, strength, and attitude. One of the dogs had a not-so-great temperament. Anyway, we were playing in this barn that backed up into the woods. In the barn was a pheasant that they were raising. It was locked in a cage, just with one of those hook locks that anyone could open. It was there simply to keep animals out. It would not have kept a human out. While we were playing one day, my friend's dad joined us in the barn and brought the dogs. He was setting up traps around the property for opossums and raccoons, or any other small predator, as there had been many around the property that would steal food or harass the other animals, including the dogs. He would set the traps and then gather them and release them miles away. At least, that's what he told us. He may have just killed them. While he was out there and setting up the traps, the dogs were acting bizarre. They did not want to go near the barn, which was totally out of character. But we finished helping him set up the traps and headed inside. The next morning before we left, we wanted to see if anything had been caught in the traps, so we headed out towards the barn with our friend's dad to check them. He advised not to go near the traps if anything was in there. He would take care of gathering them. As we walked out the door of the house, which was visible to this barn but not close, one of our friends who was there said they saw something big exit the barn. We all laughed, and my friend's dad joked that it was Bigfoot. When we got close to the barn, it was shocking. There had been a raccoon caught in one of the traps, but it was laying outside the trap, torn to shreds. The dogs, who were with us, were going crazy. My friend's dad went into the barn with the dogs and advised us to all start walking back to the house. Apparently the pheasant cage had been opened, and the pheasant was no longer there, other than a few feathers. At this point, the dogs were going crazy. They were riled up, but also seemed skittish. I think they also sensed our collective anxiety. As we walked back to the house, we all unmistakably saw a dark figure near the back of the barn, looking at us from behind a tree in the woods behind the barn. We all saw it. This wasn't a hallucination. It was about the height of a grown man and had patches of hair everywhere. 2 others stated that they saw a second figure farther back in the woods with a set of visible eyes as well, but I didn't see that. We all began screaming and running back to the house. My friend's dad was close behind us with the dogs. He tried to give us some story about how it could have been an animal, but he was visibly shaken and was just trying to calm us. None of us ever heard what transpired after that day, but we all saw it. Also, the trap and the lock on the pheasant cage could have only been opened by a person. An animal couldn't have done it. One of the kids in our group refused to ever go back to my friend's house. The adults chalked it up to kids being imaginative, but my friend's dad clearly saw it too. We still talk about that day, and I am 38 years old now. My grandpa was born in the last years of the 19th century and spent his entire life living in rural Idaho as a farmer and rancher. He had tons of old cowboy stories he would tell us grandkids. Most of them were funny, some were cautionary, but a few were downright creepy. When my grandpa was 6 years old, he, along with his older brother and a gang of kids from nearby farms, decided to go ice skating for the day. At that time, my great-grandpa was working as a ranch hand, and the family lived near Chesterfield, Idaho, now mostly a ghost town. It was a bright and sunny January day in 1902, and though the temperature was low, the sun kept things somewhat warm. They had hitched their sleighs to their horses and headed down to the Port Neuf River to ice skate. There were 8 kids altogether, and they were excited to show off their new skates from Christmas. Along with my grandpa and his brother, there were the 3 Robertson kids, Tommy Bayer, and the Gooch twins. The best spot to skate was next door to the Gooch's ranch. The river there was broad and shallow, so the ice tended to be thicker, and if they did fall through, they would just get their legs wet. The kids spent a couple of hours skating when a loud scream came from a willow bush on the riverbank opposite them. The kids could only watch as a giant man, covered head to toe in thick black fur, came lumbering out of the bushes. It was carrying a large tree branch and was screaming in rage at the kids. They fled towards the sleighs, trying to scramble up the riverbank in their skates. My grandpa, being the youngest, was at the back of the rush. He couldn't get a good foothold because of the skates and fell back towards the ice. The giant was now crossing the river toward them, screaming and swinging his branch. My grandpa was sure this creature was going to eat him. As my grandpa tells it, Lady Luck smiled down on me that day by the river, because as the giant was midway across the river, the ice gave way. It only submerged its shins, but was slowed down considerably as it tried to get back on top of the ice. This gave my grandpa's brother enough time to jump down and cut the laces of my grandpa's skates. They left the skates and dashed up the riverbank and jumped onto the sleigh. As they looked back, the giant man was cresting the riverbank. To their relief, it didn't chase the sleighs. It just stood there, hollering at the kids and swinging his tree branch. The kids were able to make it back to the Gooch ranch, where they told their encounter to John Gooch, the twins' grandfather. Word spread quickly in the tiny farming community, and soon a posse was formed to hunt down the beast. Where the kids had been skating, there was found footprints almost 2 feet in length. My grandpa's skates were found near the tracks. They had both been bent in half like horseshoes. The tracks headed west into the nearby mountains. The posse followed them as far as they could, but deep snow prevented their travel any further. The creature was never sighted in the area again. The story captivated the small community, and soon word traveled across the country of the Idaho wild man. That spring, my great-grandpa decided to buy a ranch in the little lost river valley farther north in Idaho. My grandpa had many other weird and creepy backwoods stories, but he always said that this encounter frightened him the most. He wasn't sure he would have been killed if the giant hadn't broken through the ice and given his brother a chance to cut his laces. First time posting here or anywhere. Wanted to recount a bizarre series of events from my childhood and figured this was the best place to do it. When I was a kid, I lived in Clinton, Tennessee. Both parents worked full-time, so I was often sent over to stay at my grandparents', who had a plot of land in the vicinity of, but not right in, Moshame, near Greenville. Both of them had been in East Tennessee for their whole lives, and that area a good many years. They had been established at their home for some decades before this story, and remained there a good time after. Recently I had reason to return to that area in Tennessee, after having spent the majority of my adult life in Minnesota. Being in and around the area, driving the same roads made me reminiscent about my lazy summer days tucked away at my grandparents', learning to shoot on the same .22 with which Grandpa had taught Mum, feeding fish at the neighbor's stocked pond, or spotting deer and bear with binoculars from the back porch. When I relayed this to my mum, she in turn told me a story about a time I scared my grandpa half to death, then lied about hanging out with Bigfoot. At first I had no idea what she was on about. Then I remembered exactly what actually happened with startling clarity. New context given by the experience adulthood provides. And no, this is not about Bigfoot or a cryptid. Before we start, some information about my grandparents' land. Their house was on a small hill surrounded by a grass lawn. The hill gave way to a smallish hayfield, then the woodline. Those woods lasted for a good half mile to either side of the home, and a good several miles to the back. I hated the hayfield because it was too pokey to play in, but I liked to hang out in a creek that ran behind it. To get there, I would walk to the edge of the property, just in the woodline to avoid the hay. While at my grandparents', the only rules were that I stay where I could see the house, so the house could see me. I was to take a whistle with me, anywhere I went. I didn't take the whistle, seeing it as a badge of my regrettably young age. And the best part of the creek was, it was out of sight of the house. That was the only stretch to where it got deeper than my knees, and thus the only part where I could swim. Naturally, I spent much of my time in that water, splashing around, skipping stones, and being a kid. One day I was playing in the creek when I noticed someone. It was a man, a stranger, on the bank watching me. He had long hair, a beard, and pale skin so dirty it was stained. I could not tell his age, and simply thought of him as old. I have no better guess now, as he clearly went through long years of hard living. He wore no shirt, no pants, only a wrap of dirty cloth around his waist that I thought of as a Moses dress, thanks to some illustrated Bible stories. Around his neck there were multiple necklaces, made from knotted tatters of cloth, fiber and string. In those knots were various pieces of detritus, mostly bones, but some flowers and bits of dark glass. When I first saw him, there by the creek, I was terrified, frozen still. The man, however, was smiling. He gestured from his squat with an outstretched arm, fingers down, in a kind of "don't stop for me" wave. I didn't react, startled and reeling. Then, he splashed at me, still smiling. He did it again. I splashed back, and soon, we were playing. We both threw water at each other. He jumped into the creek and stomped around with me, laughing all the while. He threw rocks into the water and so did I. I pushed him. He pushed me back. We carried on for some minutes until my grandma called for me. With her voice, a switch had turned off. The man stopped in his tracks, gaze fixed back toward the house. Then, as my grandma kept on hollering, he looked to me. He crept back to his side of the creek, barely disturbing the water, then slid into the brush, completely silent the whole way, holding my gaze. Once he was out of sight, I waited in the water until my grandma found me. She wanted to know if I was alone. I said no. She became very tense, asking who was with me while looking around. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. Seeing no one, she pulled me back into the house, without any more words, gripped like iron the whole time. At the house, the real inquisition began. I didn't really have new words. The event and this reaction overwhelming my ability to explain. Such silence further irked my grandma, and I was swiftly placed in a corner, held without bail, awaiting patriarchal judgment. Around an hour later, my grandpa came home from work. He was told about my churlishness and was ready to set into me again when I started talking. I told him about the man, hairy and old, dressed like Moses, about how he played, then he disappeared. I remembered they digested this for a few minutes before sending me to my room. I was happy to go, and happier still, Grandpa did not yell like he usually did when misbehaved. Later, I was brought out for dinner. I ate in the kitchen with Grandma, but Grandpa called me to the back porch. He was on the swinging bench, looking out over the hayfield turned red by the setting sun. He had kicked off his boots and put them next to his shotgun. I knew that was odd for the gun to be out of the closet. Previously, we had used it to shoot bottles. Some he would get me to throw them into the air like they were clay pigeons. These escapades were accompanied by speeches about how the gun was dangerous and only for adults to use. He went through my story again, his tone deadly serious. Eventually he asked me how hairy was the man, really. I told him very, thinking this was the right answer. He asked where. I told him everywhere like a bear. He ruminated on this, and I grew more nervous, worried I was in trouble or causing trouble, just wanting the trouble, wherever it lay, to end. So when he finally asked me to swear, in the name of Christ and on my mother, that I was telling the truth about everything, I said I had been joking. He finally yelled then, and sent me back to my room. The family memory became that I had hid by the creek and made up a tale about Bigfoot. At the time, everyone was very upset with me, and I was forbidden from going back to the creek or anywhere out of sight. The enforcement of this rule, like the others, was lackluster. Even so, for a time, I didn't go to the creek. In my memory, I stayed away for a very long time, but I am sure it was only for a few days. That hiatus, feeling indeterminable to my elementary-aged self. When I did start going to the creek, I took a bucket of toys, mostly Godzilla, and a thick stick plucked from the wood line on the way. I think I was conflicted about what to do if the man came back, imagining either impressing him with my toy collection or clubbing him, or both in turn. When he did show back up, he appeared next to me as I dozed under a tree on my side of the creek. I was once again gripped with terror. He was not smiling, his face expressionless as he lurked beside me, having watched for who knows how long before I smelled him. I scrambled away, leaving behind my stick and toys. Coming to my feet, a yard out, I stood in the sun while the man watched me from the shade. Eventually, he crouched and started to look through my bucket. I remember becoming indignant as he examined my toys one by one, only to toss them into the dirt. It became too much and I started to lecture the man, telling him about how he got me into trouble, how he was a weirdo, how he stank. At some point, he stopped looking through my things and calmly watched my tirade, face still neutral, eyes analytic. Once I had concluded my lecture, I sat back under the tree to pout, having become hot in the sun. I remember the man made a noise, a grinding kind of snort, and when I looked over at him, he was chuckling while he inspected the last few figures in my bucket. I wanted to laugh too, but was more determined to stay sullen. Once everything was out of the bucket, he then put one figure, Ghidorah, back into the bucket. He then stood to his hunched fullest. He took the bucket by its handle, began to make its way back into the woods. I stayed by the tree until he turned, said something, not a word I knew or know, and gestured with a forward sweep of his hand. At first I didn't comply, despite knowing he wanted me to follow. After a few moments he yipped, clicked his teeth, and gestured again more emphatically. With this further prompt, I did get up and come along, the man making approving noises and putting on his smile again. We went into the woods. The man led, but he was naturally quicker and quieter, making it hard to keep up. Eventually he would stop when he lost me, knocking on trees with sticks and whistling arrhythmically so that I may find him in the vegetation. He never came back for me, opting instead to guide me forward with the noises. I became lost, having only a vague sense of my grandparents' place being behind me. After some time, maybe 15 minutes, we came to a bald. The man had me wait there, indicated by patting the ground, before going into the tree line alone. He returned from a different direction, pulling a sled. It was made from half a discarded plastic drum and lined with small pelts and smooth bark. On the back half, there rested the fly-covered carcasses of squirrels, opossums, and other critters savaged into anonymity. On the pulling end, woven pouches were tied into place by the same eclectic cordage that made the man's necklaces. He put my bucket on the sled and tossed Ghidorah into a pouch. He then called me closer with a guttural noise and beckoning wave. I saw the sled's pouches held many odds and ends: dried salamanders, mushrooms, metal bits, glass fragments. From one, the man pulled a square made from bound-together sticks, just big enough to slip over my wrist. From another, he pulled a piece of fool's gold and a small shard of geode, crusted with a bit of purple crystal. These he handed to me, with an air of business and a few more utterings of nonsense. He then patted the ground for me to sit again. I did so with much bewilderment, understanding we had traded, the same as exchanging Pokemon cards at recess. I did not much miss Ghidorah anyway, as he was a bad guy. The bucket was a loss. In retrospect, I think Ghidorah was chosen because of its dull gold scales resembled something valuable. The bucket for its obvious ability to hold things. The man came back and gestured for me to follow by slapping his thigh. I did this readily. During the hike back, I tried to keep up and pay attention. I did so moderately well, having to be whistled over a few times. I did notice that our path was not straight. The man led me one way and then another, making turns unneeded by the lay of the land. We eventually came out by the creek, but from a different approach than we had left. I could hear my grandma calling for me again, not from up on the hill, from out in the field. The man would not cross the creek, but pushed me to do so. I did, but did not go to my grandma. Instead, I crept back to the house and around to the opposite side. There, I laid by the shrubs by our front door, pretending to sleep when I was found. I swore I'd been there the whole time. When I was sent back to my room, I placed my fool's gold, crystal, and charm in my bedside table for safekeeping. The next day, I went back to the creek to pick up my toys. The man was not there. However, throughout that summer, he did visit me again, to sit under the tree or throw rocks at the water, or yammer softly to himself. I would bring snacks and candy to share, and he would likewise give me stringy dried meat, which I ought not to have ate, or honeysuckle blossoms, which I still would eat, taken from my old bucket. He seldom visited long, and never splashed and whooped like he did at our first meeting. At this point, you may be wondering why I've posted to backwoods creepy and not backwoods weird but wholesome, I guess. Well, there are two more occasions I wanted to account. One gruesome, one awful. The eventful one occurred near the 4th of July. I had brought 2 boxes of bang strips to the creek. The man was initially wary of the little fireworks, but quickly came to appreciate their miniature pyrotechnics. He took the box I gave him gratefully, even taking the empty box, likely for the wood shavings, which are excellent tinder. During the use of the bang strips, I had scared a turtle in the water and to the opposite bank. It sat there, watching us from the far shore. The man, after stowing the bang snaps in the bucket, noticed the turtle. With little thought, he scooped up a small stone and threw it with force and accuracy into the turtle. He then waded over and retrieved the slider, which struggled meekly in his grasp, one leg knocked clean off. On my side of the river, he took from the bucket a new piece of stone. One side was rounded and fit in his hand. The other came to a flinty cutting edge. Working with deft experience, the man began chopping the live turtle above its neck, pulling up on the top shell. The thing struggled and bled as it was bisected. The dome eventually coming free, the turtle dropped to mingle its viscera with dirt and sand. The man rinsed the shell in the water, then offered it to me. In wordless horror, I ran. That evening I came back to shuffle the dead turtle into the flowing waters of the creek. The shell itself was nowhere to be found. This experience did not deter me from going to the creek, or the man from visiting again. However, sometimes he would try to call me away from the creek with thumps and whistles. I would tell him I heard him and refused to move. On some occasions he would join me. On others, he would leave. The last time we met, we were sitting under a tree sharing cowtails. From the woods there came a whistling and the staccato knocking of a woodpecker. The man looked up and whistled back. There were a few more such exchanges before he stood, collected his bucket, and beckoned for me to follow. I was curious and felt comfortable with the man as a guide, so I did as asked. He took me back to the bold, a direct path this time, periodically stopping to call or respond to the other in the wood. Waiting for us at the bold was a woman and a child. The woman was dressed the same as the man, topless, wrapped at the waist. She was dirty with long hair and a wiry frame. The child was in a similar state, wearing a sack that went to their knees. The man sat on the ground and the woman joined him, sitting in his lap but leaning forward so that her elbows rested on her crossed knees. She had dark brown eyes that were fixed to me. The other child would not look up. I didn't know what to do and didn't speak. The other kid lifted their sack to wipe at their nose, and I learned, under all that dirt, they were a her. The man made a noise and drummed on the woman's bare back. The kid looked at them, still hanging their head, hair covering her face. The woman yammered and swatted at the girl lazily, the man echoing her noises, slapping skin to skin once more. At this bizarre scene, the girl stumbled towards me, stopping close enough that I could smell her and hear her wheezing breath. She was thin, but not emaciated, and slightly taller than me, should she have straightened up. The man and woman fussed some more. Then the girl leaned close and pressed her cheek to mine. Her hair was in between us, greasy and cold. She made no move to embrace me, no move at all, only pressing limply against me and breathing so loud that it was all I could hear. During this time the woman had approached. She pulled the girl back by her shoulder with one hand and delivered a flurry of slaps to the crown of the girl's head. The woman then gathered the girl's hair in one hand, using the other to sweep back her bangs. The girl was then made to look at me, face bare. One side of her jaw was bulged out, smooth skin over a lemon-shaped bump. Her mouth was twisted by this deformity. Her nose faced to one side as if affixed sideways and leaked a trail of clear snot. One eye was bulged and roomy, the other startlingly regular. It looked at me, blank and dark brown. The woman gave the girl's head a little shake, spat off to the side, then cooed like a dove as she smiled at me. I fled. There was commotion behind me. I think the girl was pushed to the ground. I did not look back, and they did not pursue. My flight ended at my grandparents' house, my absence unnoticed. I chose not to tell anyone what had happened. wanting to forget, not wanting to get into trouble, not thinking about the girl, the couple, what was intended for me. I spent that August inside whenever I visited my grandparents. I begged not to be taken there, claiming it was boring and lonely. Sometimes when I sat on the porch or went from the car to the house, I'd catch a snippet of a bird call in the wind, or the distant tapping of wood and hurry inside. My grandma could tell something was wrong and made an effort to entertain me in town. My grandpa cared in his own way, involving me in his errands as he never had before. Eventually, school started. Classes and friends eased me away from thoughts of the dirty man or the people in the clearing. Time did the rest. I think now that all the people in the clearing were a family, but their features, white skin, brown eyes, brown hair, are common enough that they all could have been unrelated. I'm sure they lived together. They all knew each other's signs and signals. They used their own words. I know that the Smokies are full of tales of feral people, wild men, and superstition. I also know that they are full of people living in unlikely ways, in unlikely places, and that those real people call others kin, and that through the chain of human connection, even a recluse living in a rundown shack is someone's somebody. I guess I am asking if the people in my story are somebody's someone, or if they are known, or if their behavior rings any bells, belies any known intention. I figured here, where the tale would not be discounted out of hand, might be the right place to ask. I live in quite a remote part of England, the Peak District. My family owns a small farm here. As you can imagine, at night it's completely black outside, but the skies can be amazing for stargazing because we live so far out and high up. Anyway, this was about 5 years ago. I was looking out of my bedroom window. It faces onto the back of our farm. There's an indoor animal pen not far from the house in front. Across the yard, then to the left, we have a large field that is bordered by a wooded area on the far side. As I look, there is a glowing figure just stood at the very side of the field. It wasn't really bright, and I almost missed it, but it was a human figure, and it was just stood there, looking up. Not really at me though. I was quite freaked out, and when I'm scared, often I'll just freeze. So I was staring at it for a good minute, but then I saw it fade away. It didn't walk away or anything like that, it literally faded. It was definitely not a reflection of any sort on the glass. To this day, it still freaks me out, and I keep my windows closed whenever it is dark. I'll start off by saying that I live super close to the Appalachian region of the US. Our family lives on a large farm, and we've all seen strange things from time to time, and just accept it as part of the land and keep on about ourselves. I live next door to my grandmother, and my husband and I have seen multiple different black masses, the Watcher, and even a cowboy-shaped mass up near her house. Yesterday evening, however, I witnessed the weirdest entity I've ever encountered. We were outside, talking, when all of a sudden our dog alerted toward her front porch and started growling. She's never growled before, and I stepped down to see what she was looking at, since it was a new behavior, with teeth showing and the hair on the back of her neck standing straight up. I look in the direction she's looking at, and I see this black mass slithering into her front door. Instant goosebumps and uneasy feeling. I tried to debunk this by moving around to see if I could recreate it, but nothing looked like it. It was about 6 inches tall, but about 2 feet long, and it was an oblong shape. It was solid black and had waves of grey coming off of it that reminded me of heat coming off pavement when it's super hot and rained just a little bit. It was floating at the top of the stair rails and literally slithering up and down as it was going into her door. nowhere close to the floor of the porch. It moved really fast, but was slow enough that I was able to see the entire thing. As soon as it was completely in the house, the feeling was gone and my dog eased, but still kept her eye on the porch. This land always had an eerie feeling to it. There's also been several familial deaths on the property, all cancer or accident related. And there's a small family graveyard to the right of my grandmother's house, of the family that owned the land prior to my family. Just wondering if anyone may have any information on what I saw. It's shaken me up because, out of all the things I've witnessed here, this one was the first to give me a dreadful feeling. I've scoured the internet and can't find anything.
This is a story that goes back to the late 70s. My friend's family, they owned a huge amount of land that included owning half of a mountain. This property, it used to be an old banana growing area that once dominated the hillsides of this area. The name is withheld. So, you can imagine the impact it had on the environment. All the chemicals that were used on spraying bananas with, soaking in the land and waterways and creeks. Luke and I had already had a spooky experience, so we were not new to this stuff. Luke's dad, Jim, warned us about heading out into the back blocks where there's king browns and yellow-bellied black snakes lurking about. But we were pretty savvy about the bush. We were going to camp in the scrub, no more than about 3 k's from the main house, for a couple of days, explore the region, do some yabby fishing, or basically just mucking around, having an adventure. Luke told me that we're staying in an old abandoned packing shed. It was a banana packing shed in its past life, when the Italian POWs were working the land. A good lot stayed behind and married into the local community, or into the local indigenous. Luke told me there's also an old graveyard close by, with some of the POWs buried there, ones who were bitten by snakes mostly. That excited me. We got to the old packing shed. It was a corrugated iron tin shed, rusting, but still sturdy, as in strong. We managed to somehow get the door open by bashing the old rusted lock off with a rock. And we were hit by the stench of enclosure. Inside, there were still steel tables bolted to the floor, coated with spider webs and years upon years worth of dust. There were some old tools, rusted beyond repair, but still fascinating to find. We swept the floor clean so we can unroll our sleeping bags, unpack our gear before going outside to explore. The day was getting rather late as we wandered about. At one point, I got a strange feeling of someone watching. I didn't tell Luke, just in case he called me a wimp, so I just stayed quiet. "That track there," Luke said, pointing to a trail that snaked into the scrub. "That's where the boneyard is. Check it out in the morning, eh?" I agreed, and then I had to ask, "Hey, is there anyone else living around here?" "Yeah," he says, "just the local indigenous. They camp by the creek a few days, do a bit of hunting. Dad doesn't mind. They look after the land while they camp there." "Are they around at the moment?" He shook his head. "No. They normally come around the end of winter. Why's that?" I told him, and he looked around quickly. "I think we should head back to the shed," he said. And so, we did. That night, we settled down, had our dinner, lukewarm baked beans and soggy toast, Luke brought along a pack of cards, so we sat and played a few games. It started to rain, but we weren't bothered. We weren't going to be cut off by the flood, for we were located on a hillock. We really weren't that far from Luke's place. His dad could come in the four-wheel drive and pick us up if it did become bad. It was coming on to 10 o'clock, and we were both ready to retire to our sleeping bags, when suddenly, we both heard it. At first, we thought it was the wind, but the more we listened, the more it became human, or inhuman, I should say. We heard what sounded gruesomely like people getting slaughtered. We heard women, young men, all screaming. We heard what sounded like gunshots, and men laughing, dogs barking and growling, men shouting, and all at the same time, rain battered at the shed, wind howled. This kept up for a half hour. The screaming, crying, shooting, shouting, laughter, and then it faded. We sat there, listening. All we could hear was the cane toads croaking and some nighttime frogs somewhere also croaking. The next morning came, and it found two very sleepless boys, scared out of their wits, rushing out of the old packing shed and making our way back home. We went over and over the scene again, making no sense of it. We kept that to ourselves until a few years back, I went into Luke's father's funeral. We got talking, and the incident came up. He told me the story about what we both heard that night, something his father, Jim, told him, as well as researching over the years. What we'd heard that night were the echoes of time, a massacre of indigenous people by white settlers. It was all over the death of a cow that was found dead, so these white farmers got together and got pissed as judges before going out and shooting dead over 60 innocent people. As it turned out, the cow had died of old age. The men who did the killings were never brought to justice, and the bastard's ancestors are still living in the area. This happened in 1921. Luke and I, we heard the past screaming for justice. Luke and his siblings, they sold that land back to the local Indigenous Land Council. They also sold the house that Luke's father built. Too much blood is soaked in that land. It weeps for justice.
A bit of context. My parents recently bought a farm last year in Australia and have been building a property on it for their retirement. It's right beside a national park and reasonably close to the next property over. The only thing that sucked is that we have no cell service, besides the top paddock where they are building their house. Not too dodgy, right? Well, I'm a university student, 21 female, in my second year of nursing, and frequently come up to the farm to help them out with their livestock and whatnot. At first everything was fine. We had a small 2-bedroom cabin in the lower paddock that I stayed in every time I came up. My room had a large window that faced to the national park, and at night when it was pitch black, it would freak me out a bit, but nothing too serious. Sure, we had the usual noises of foxes and the livestock at night time, and nothing out of the ordinary. Things really ramped up when I had to stay up there alone to feed the livestock for a few days while my parents went back to the city. I went about the usual chores, feeding the sheep, keeping an eye on the lambs, and checking in at the building site to keep an eye on everything. I went into town to get some dinner at the local pub, and by the time I got home, it was roughly 10 p.m. I would usually take my car up to the top paddock at night to call my friends, check social media, etc. My car was lit up by my internal navigation system that's always on, which meant I couldn't really see outside the car, besides from my headlights. I was midway through my social media scroll when I thought I saw something black flash across the paddocks where my headlights were facing. I drove my car in a quick circle to use my car's headlights as a massive torch, and didn't see anything. No reflections of cattle's eyes like I usually do, or the usual fox or rabbit. I tried not to pay too much attention to it, and went back to my social media scroll, until I accidentally pressed my brakes, which allowed my brake lights to flood the paddock behind my car with an eerie red light. The same black flash that I saw through my windshield flickered out of the corner of my eye in the rearview mirror. Now I got suspicious. I turned off the music I was listening to and just sat for a second, trying to assure myself that I was just tired. After a few seconds of silence, I was relieved and was about to turn my car on to go back to my cabin, and that's when I heard what I can only describe as claws on my rear windshield. Tap, tap, scratch. I've never sped as fast as I did back to the cabin that night. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of something watching me in the forest. You know, that sort of tingling sense of something staring into the back of your head. After tossing and turning, I put up a newspaper in front of my window that faces the woods until it was completely covered, and the feeling immediately went away. Sleep didn't come easy, safe to say. The following night, I chose to go up to the top paddock while it was still reasonably light. All was peaceful, and I had all but forgotten last night's events. I was admiring the gorgeous pink sunset when I saw a flash of green in the sky. It traveled for a split second and then disappeared. Now listen, I'm not one for UFOs, but I know it wasn't a helicopter because it was light enough to see the sky and the stars weren't even up yet. I thought it was cool, so I called one of my friends who was a massive skeptic about everything paranormal, and of course, she thought I was nuts and proceeded to give me shit for it. It started to get too dark for my liking, so I went back to the cabin to cook some dinner. All was fine until I went to sleep, the newspaper from the night before still clinging to my window. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the sheep making a racket. I grabbed my dad's rifle, assuming it was another fox, and went to take a look on foot with my spotlight. Now, usually when you bring a very bright light and piss off the sheep, who are already going nuts, you hear about it. Keyword being usually. I walked over to the paddock and started scanning with my spotlight, but didn't see anything. The sheep were bleating like crazy, but none were injured, or even remotely. They were in a corner of a paddock huddled together, like they usually do when there is a fox. That was until they all went silent. 1 second they were so loud they echoed around the hills, and the next, it was dead silent. Now I was truly scared. I raised my rifle and started looking around, feeling like everything around me had its eyes on me. It was then that I heard a thump of something heavy being dropped on the ground, heavy enough for me to feel the vibration in my feet. I booked it back to the cabin and locked everything behind me. I was pacing around, double-checking the doors and windows when I heard it. It sounded like humming, but distorted alongside footsteps. These footsteps weren't human though. It was as if it was limping and then quickly recovering all around the cabin and stopping at my bedroom window. I curled to the ground, gripping my rifle until my fingers were frozen in place. That was how I slept that night. I left first thing in the morning without even looking to check to see if there were any footsteps. Now, if anyone has any clue what is happening, what this thing is, or can tell me what I can do, please comment. I haven't been able to go back to my parents' farm since. I graduated high school almost a year ago. I had really no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before them. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of, called WWOOF.com. Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You can pay a small fee, and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the deep south. I got there, and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. Everyone else, however, self-absorbed, condescending, right out of college but vapid as shit hipsters. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I'd been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation. And then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he had left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city, about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room, doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to really get involved with the farming and throw himself into Krishna consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences punctuated with and or, and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of the friends I left back home. We became fast friends, and he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when he spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course drugs. Every now and then he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he came to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure a week more. A couple of days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botched siege by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. The governor's always trying to silence people preaching the truth. That's so messed up. I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was a sociopathic cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject I had just explained to him, and now he's telling me I'm wrong and that Koresh was a martyr. This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of his absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. I'm not having this conversation with a fucking loon, Michael. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket praying I had grabbed my knife before I left the cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool in the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around so he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what happened, and that we had to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it very strange he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by, and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscience. Late one night, I got a text. "Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling?" I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office, using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud baying coming from the barn. I remember thinking, it must be an animal, but also thinking it must be a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in a corner of my kitchen, facing the wall. I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make. Something you would only hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo. The noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained Michael and I's history and what had happened that night. There wasn't much they could do since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon since, I believe, many of the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might be out in those woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up. To start, in my culture, we avoid saying ghosts, especially the particular ghosts' names. For example, in Western culture, there's banshee, woman in white, boogeyman, and stuff like that. In my culture, I'm Malaysian. We have ghosts like Pontianak, Pokong, Toyol, Lang Suir, among others. Saying their names out loud is said to summon them. I love ghost stories, but not the Western kind. I love Asian ghost stories, perhaps because that's what I grew up with. I find them spookier than Western ghosts. Due to the language barrier, there is not a lot of Malaysian ghost stories available in English, so 6 years ago, I started a YouTube channel where I read ghost stories that are mainly from Southeast Asia. I would record my voice, reading the stories at home, of course. I was living with another girl at the time. She also happened to be my colleague. We were working at a customer service call center that operates 24 hours, and our shift rotates weekly. Our 2-bedroom apartment was really small, so there was barely any privacy when it comes to noises, so I would usually only record when my roommate was out. I didn't want to bother her with my voice, and I would prefer not to have sounds from her going about her life in my recording. One time my roommate was working the overnight shift. She left around 8 o'clock in the evening, and I just got home from work 2 hours prior, so I decided to record my second video. About half an hour after my roommate left for work, I started recording in my bedroom. I think it was little more than halfway through the second story. I heard someone entering the apartment. This was weird since her shift should at least take about 8.5 hours. I thought if she came home early, it would be more than likely that she's not feeling well, so I went to check on her. When I went to look for her, she was nowhere to be found. The only logical explanation was the sound was from the next door unit, so I went back to recording. Not more than 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of a chair being pulled from under the dining table, and followed by running water in our shower room just seconds later. Confident I was home alone, I went to check. My bedroom door was facing directly to the shower room door. As soon as I opened my bedroom door, I had a clear view of the opened shower door, revealing a dark shower room. At this point, I was getting nervous. My thoughts were all over the place. I froze for a bit before I decided to look into the shower. The sound of the water running could still be heard. When I flicked the shower room light on, the shower was running, but there was no one in there. I turned off the shower and went looking for my roommate again. Maybe I missed her the first time, but still, I found nobody in the apartment. I was a little nervous, but was determined to continue recording. I wanted to be a YouTuber and hoping one day I can quit my job and tell ghost stories full time. So I did. I finished recording the stories and went straight into editing. Around 1 a.m, I needed a toilet break. The toilet was separate from the shower and could only be accessed through the kitchen. After I had done my business, and while I was passing through the kitchen, I could hear a giggle from the living room. That stopped me in my tracks. I had a clear view of the well-lit living room. There was obviously no one there. At this point, I knew I was not alone. I ran into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I hid under my covers, and that's when I heard something try to open my bedroom door. It went on for what felt like forever. I fell asleep and somehow I finished editing my story, posted it a few days later. Everything quietened down for a while, so I decided to record another story. This time I was recording during the daytime. It was my off day and my housemate was out shopping or something. Everything went smoothly, so smoothly that I was able to post the video by the time my housemate came home. That night we decided to watch a movie together. Before we started the movie, I went into the kitchen to make myself some snacks while my roommate picked a movie. Our TV is positioned on the same wall that divided the living room and my bedroom, and the sofa right across from it, so you can see the kitchen door and shower room door when sitting on the sofa. As I was coming out from the kitchen, I asked my roommate if she has found a movie. She was looking at me with a surprised look. "Didn't you just go into the shower room like 30 seconds ago?" she asked. I just shook my head and went to sit. The topic was dropped and we picked a Malaysian horror comedy movie. Mid-movie, our shower room door whipped open violently, and we heard what sounded like a giggle. My roommate decided to sleep in my room that night. That was the last time we watched anything related to ghosts. Since then, I often hear furniture being moved, giggles, and see shadows moving in my peripherals. But whenever I turn to look, there is nothing. Sometimes even when my roommate is home. She has also experienced some spooky stuff in the apartment, like her back being tapped by something while she was in the kitchen, hearing my voice calling her name when I was not home, and shadows running from the kitchen into the shower room while she was watching TV in the living room. I stayed there for a few more months until my roommate quit her job to move back to her hometown, and I decided to move in with another colleague. The new house was much larger. It was a 3-story house. I stopped recording ghost stories for a while after that. Even though I love ghost stories, I do not particularly like experiencing one. It took me about 8 or 9 months before I had the courage to record another one. It was not a very good idea. I'll post that story soon. And if you're wondering why I'm sharing this story now, apparently, even after I stopped recording ghost stories, I still encounter supernatural activity. So I thought I may as well share it anyway. So this happened in 2019, but to fill in the gap, I moved from the old apartment to a new place sometime in December 2016. My life got busy, but I managed to record one video sometime in 2018, but I didn't really stick to it. I got married by the end of 2018 with a Canadian citizen, and we moved into our rental 3-bedroom low-cost flat on the other side of the city. Due to him not having any work visa while staying in Malaysia, he was mostly doing online studies and helping me around the house. After a while, he got depressed due to lack of progress in his personal career growth. So I came up with the idea, why don't we restart my Ghost Stories YouTube channel? But this time, he can help me edit and tell stories. He agreed and we started recording sometime in September 2019. The first video was recorded with ease. Nothing scary happened. It was all fine and dandy. However, we did avoid recording at night, especially after my husband found out the legend behind the theme song that I chose. The song is called Ulak Mayang. It is said that this song was a mantra that was used by witch doctors to repel or cleanse dark spirits. For easy understanding, I will refer to it as an exorcism from now on. According to the legends, the song came into existence after a witch doctor tried to save a fisherman who became unconscious after going on a fishing trip. It was said his soul was trapped in the jinn's world after 7 jinn princesses became fond of him. After a while, the exorcism ritual becomes more elaborate and includes dancing. With the time passing and the people of Peninsular Malaysia being introduced to religion, first Hinduism, then Islam, and animism fades, the Ulak Mayang becomes nothing more than just a folk song and dance routine. However, it is still rumored to cause possession amongst dancers while performed. So it became less and less popular. But I thought it would be a good idea to use it as a theme song, and I somehow thought it would be okay if I sang it myself, cause it's not real. I admit, it was not a very smart move. However, things started to get weird during the recording of the second video. We did our recording session one story a day kind of thing because even though my husband was a stay-at-home husband, I still have a full-time job. During the recording of the last story, we ran a little late and ended up recording until close to dusk, around 7 PM. Since our goal was to post every Friday, and that was a Friday evening, I talked my husband into editing the video that night. Since our video is just an audio video, and there is not that much to edit, it only took him less than 2 hours to get it all done and posted on the YouTube channel. The rest of our night went like normal, until it was time to go to bed. It was not even midnight, and we were laying on our bed trying to fall asleep. Then, we heard what sounded like chairs being dragged from upstairs. Soon after, we heard the same ticking sound, like when a handful of marbles hit the floor, also from upstairs. After this had been going on for about 5 minutes, reality hit me. We are the upstairs neighbor. Our apartment is only 5 stories high. Our unit is the top leftmost unit. My first guess was there's someone squatting on the roof, but then there's no simple or easy access to the roof at all. Since my husband didn't mention it, and I didn't want to freak him out, I just kept quiet about it. We went to bed, but we kept hearing the noises almost every night since then. One evening, we were watching some anime in our living room, when suddenly an empty cup that was on our dining table just randomly fell onto the floor. We were both startled and got up to check it out. We tried to reason it as the wind knocking the cup off the table because it was a plastic cup, even though that doesn't make any sense. There is no window in our dining room. Our landlord is a contractor. Even though the outside of the flat looks pretty run down, the inside of our flat is pretty nice and was newly renovated just before we moved in. He even divided the wet kitchen and the dry kitchen with a classy looking glass wall and glass door. The other windows were kept closed as we run the AC. The same night I was woken up by my husband's half scream. When I got up, he looked like he was having a bad dream, so I woke him up. He told me that he saw an old woman with a scary face walking towards him from our door. We had our headboard on the wall opposite to the door, and our feet were pointed towards the bedroom door. He said he thought he woke up and saw the old woman approaching him, but he couldn't move, so he tried to scream. He insisted that I play some Islamic prayer until he fell back asleep. My husband is Caucasian. He was Christian until his family had a fallout with their church when he was in his early teens. So most of his life, he didn't really have a particular faith. So for him to ask me to play an Islamic prayer is serious. At least, that's how I feel. Because I am not religious and don't really talk about religion to him, let alone impose it on him. That's only the beginning of our scary life in that apartment. After the first time my husband had the night terror, we continued to record another video. The last video we recorded in Malaysia. Partly because we wanted to do it in hopes that it would turn into something we do full time, as we enjoyed telling ghost stories. We still do, that's why I'm writing this now. My husband was finally excited about something since the time he became a house husband, and it was a nice at-home activity for us, like spending quality time. While recording the third video, posted at the end of September 2019, we were careful to do it only during the day. However, it didn't save us or make the haunting in our home any better. In fact, the furniture dragging and marble dropping was becoming more often, up to the point that we could hear it every night. On top of that, my husband's night terrors also became more frequent. Playing Ayatul Kursi became our nightly routine, and when we forgot, my husband would have a night terror. It never stopped the sounds though. We kept hearing it. Apart from that, things were quiet for the rest of 2019. The most frightening thing happened in January of 2020, a couple of weeks before we left for Canada. My husband and I were packing our stuff, and we stayed up until much later than we usually did. We were using clothes that we were not planning to wear as wraps for our breakable items and putting them in the boxes in the living room. Our living room was well lit, and we usually left the balcony light off. This made the glass door to our balcony become more reflective, and we can barely see outside apart from the lights coming from the parking lot and the stairs light from the flat across from ours. We also had no drapes for our balcony door. The landlord didn't put up any curtain rod there for some reason. We didn't install our own because we didn't know how long we were going to stay there. We were waiting for the results of my PR application and were planning to move to Canada as soon as we got it. As we were packing, we heard what seemed like someone knocking on our balcony door with their long fingernails. We both instinctively turned our heads to the balcony and stared at it for a good 15 seconds. We saw nothing. And then we heard it again. There was still nothing. Our balcony was bare. There was nothing out there that could hit the glass door. My husband grabbed my arm and signaled me to get up, and we both went to our bedroom, and I played the Ayatul Kursi from my phone. After a couple of minutes, we could hear the nails on our bedroom window now. I decided to recite the Ayatul Kursi myself, with a louder voice. Midway through, our window rattled for 2 or 3 seconds, and the knocking and tapping sound disappeared, and we never did hear it again until we moved to Canada. The furniture dragging and marble dropping noise could still be heard every other night though. I am not sure if the next tenants who lived in that flat faced the same issues as us or not. I'm just hoping they didn't. After we moved to Canada, we stayed at my mother-in-law's apartment for a year. We recorded a couple of times during the pandemic out of boredom and hopes that we are in a new country and maybe it would be alright. It totally wasn't. Thanks for listening. My wife and 5 kids moved into this old farmhouse in May of 2022. It sits on 8 acres of farmland and surrounded by more farmland. The house has changed owners a lot. That had me a little worried, but it's been peaceful. So I've even commented recently that it seems we don't have any haunting issues. Then, this happened. This morning my wife witnessed a tube of chapstick spin like a top on the linoleum kitchen floor. I heard it spinning. It was spinning fast. It sounded mechanical, it was so fast. Like a motor running. Prior to this, the only thing was my oldest son thinking he heard voices in the barn. But he was riding a quad in the field and passing by the barn, so I discounted this. We have a lot of animals, including cats and dogs. There's not been any weirdness other than this one event. It's always seemed peaceful here, and we have gotten comfortable living here. I'm worried about any type of escalation. Okay, the lights in the downstairs bathroom and the master closet flicker a lot, and the bathroom ones burn out. That may just be a wiring issue, and I've been worried about that. One more thing. My wife's best friend and her husband were sleeping in the shop, and he was leaving through the main door and says he felt something grab his arm and pull him back in. We figured that since their house was experiencing odd things like that, it was something attached to him and not our house. I bought a bundle of sage at a Navajo store in New Mexico a while back. I guess we might use it. I'm actually a little worried it might stir things up. We may just have to learn to live with whatever this is.
When I was around 12, I lived in a new high-rise building with my family that felt a little off. Several times when I was able to convince my parents that it's okay to go out and leave me to watch TV alone, I would start hearing voices coming from the direction of the bedrooms that were identical to my family members, as well as the distinct sounds of my mother's high heels, clear as day. There was also this one time where I woke up very early in the morning, walked over to the sitting room to watch a show that only aired at that particular time. 15 minutes after sitting on the sofa, I started hearing a knocking sound on the glass window a few meters behind me. Now, we lived 3 floors up. There were no trees or wires or anything that could touch the glass. No sill for birds to stand on, and no other buildings in front of the window either. The knocking kept going for a good 10 minutes, before it suddenly stopped. I was too terrified to turn and look. It never happened again, during that time, or any other time of day. The apartment also had a small guest bathroom that was shaped like a narrow corridor. When you stepped in, there were 2 sinks on your right and a small room at the end of the door with the toilet itself. That little room scared the bejesus out of everyone. It was fine when you were using it and in it, but the moment you turned your back or were leaving it, this intense sense of absolute fear would set in every fiber of your conscious being and scream run. We moved out a year later, and thankfully never saw what was causing the noises. Still boggles my mind thinking about it, considering there was nothing on that land before the building was erected. Me and my brother are now both in our 30s, and the topic of the bathroom came up. Before I told him how I felt, he said he was also terrified of going in there, though no one ever said anything about it at the time.
I grew up in the 90s in Minnesota. My parents divorced when I was 8, and we spent every other weekend at my dad's haunted house in East Bethel. This house had every type of ghost you could think of. A shadow man in a trench coat and brimmed hat, another separate shadow figure that danced down the hallway, a man dressed to go fishing, a doppelganger of my father, 2 giggling little girl ghosts, and many other unseen entities. The dishwasher, radios and lights would turn themselves on and off randomly. Loud banging would be heard on walls and doors. Door handles would jiggle and turn on their own. Feelings of being touched or caressed in the shower were reported. My father also had an incident where he felt someone crawl into bed with him in the middle of the night when he was the only one home. My uncle reported hearing 2 little girls giggling and singing in the basement one night while sleeping downstairs. Upon awakening the next morning, he discovered there were no kids in the house that night. Also, there was a salamander plague one night. The entire yard was covered in slimy, slithering salamanders. It only ever happened once. Not positive if that is paranormal, but it's certainly strange. One sunny Saturday morning while visiting my dad, my brother and I were up early watching cartoons. I was 8 years old and my brother was 3. As we sat on the couch, we heard 3 knocking sounds on the wall 5 to 6 feet behind us. Knock, knock, knock. Our heads quickly snapped back to look at the wall where the sound was coming from, but we saw nothing. My brother and I quickly turned to look at each other with frightened eyes. I, being the older sister, tried to be brave. I told him it was nothing. As we turned our attention back to the cartoons, my little 8-year-old brain is spinning. What if the baying noise we just heard wasn't just the pipes, as I had been told so many times? What if it was a ghost? I hate when the ghosts come around. Why isn't my dad around whenever this happens? All these thoughts swirl in my head as we hear it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it is coming from somewhere in the kitchen to our left. It's not as loud as the first time, and the sound is different. Like someone is knocking on the kitchen counter this time instead of the wall. We quickly strain our necks to peek inside the kitchen with lightning speed, to catch whomever or whatever is making that noise. Again, there is nothing there. I take a deep breath. Once again, I pretended to be brave and tell my brother, it's nothing, just ignore it. My heart is thumping in my chest, and there are butterflies in my tummy as the familiar anxiety grows worse with each passing second. I tuck myself up on the couch in a ball, not wanting my legs to dangle off the edge. I no longer feel safe. Nothing is to be trusted. Knock, knock, knock. This time the sound is coming from the dining room. I can tell the noise is coming from the wooden dining table this time. I can see the entire table from where I'm sitting with ease, and there is nothing on the table that should be making that noise. No one except me and my brother are awake. There is no one in the dining room. There's no logical reason for this knocking noise that is moving around us. Just then I realize the knocking sounds have been moving in a big circle around us. If this invisible entity is to move any closer to us, the next logical place for it to be would be in the living room, where me and my brother are currently sitting. No sooner than that thought crossed my mind, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the noise was coming from the coffee table, sitting less than 1 foot away from us. I instantly flip over the back of my couch in a reverse somersault-like motion, and run at superhuman speed to my father's bedroom. In my panic, I completely left my little 3-year-old brother behind to fend for himself. Luckily, he wasn't too far behind. We sneak into our father's room and quietly lay on the floor. Our dad would have been super pissed if we woke him up early on a Saturday morning, even for a ghost. In our commotion, we wake up our 6-year-old sister, who is sleeping on our dad's floor. Us 3 kids always slept on his floor together when we were visiting. So we quietly whisper what just happened out in the living room to our sister. As we are telling her this story, something catches our eye. We can see a black shadow under the small space between the bottom of the door and the plush carpet. This black shadow is slowly pacing back and forth in the hallway, just on the other side of the bedroom door. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like this shadow is waiting for us. Unfortunately, I don't remember what happened after this point. Somehow the rest of that memory has been lost with time, but I know for sure we didn't open that door. As an adult, I often wish I would have been brave and opened the door. What would have been waiting? Would the entity have entered the room and attacked? Would we have been shocked and confused to find the hallway empty? Would the grey shadow just keep pacing the hallway, oblivious to our frightened, curious eyes? If you get this far, thank you for listening to my story. This was one of 3 of my personal, scariest experiences living in this house. I've done a lot of research on the home and property over the years, and can't find any evidence of any death or tragedy that would account for so much paranormal activity. I've also reached out to previous and current owners to see if they had any strange experiences. The 2 families who lived there previously said they never had any strange experiences. Neither did the family who lived there right after my family. The family currently living there did not respond to my questions, and in hindsight, I regret even asking them. It wasn't cool of me to even put that thought into their head. Prior to the home being built, all I can find is that the land the house sits on was part of a farm for a family that I could find little information on. So, was my family haunted? Were we all suffering from 12 plus years of mass hysteria?
This happened about 7-ish years ago, when I was 17 and living independently for the first time since leaving the local children's home. The building I lived in was a very old stone cottage that was once used as a pigsty before being converted. On a caravan site that used to be a farm, the place was always freezing cold and always had a weird vibe about it. And a bunch of odd things happened there. But this was the main thing that stuck with me by far. At some point while living there, probably around the 6-month mark, I lost my keys. It didn't matter to me much, because it was so out in the sticks in rural Wales, UK, that I felt I could confidently leave it unlocked with no bother, and I was able to get spare keys for the other ones that were on the ring. While not being too worried or thinking that finding them was very urgent, I did search the place from top to bottom several times over the next 7 to 8 months, but never found them, nor did I come across them when I organized cupboards, drawers, or moved furniture around. They were completely gone. One morning I woke up around 10ish and came straight through to the kitchen. The place was a long rectangle with 4 rooms in a row from right to left. Bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, and a tiny hallway with front door, living room to make myself a coffee as usual. And there, right in the middle of the kitchen counter in front of the coffee pot and the kettle, as if I had just left them there the night before, were my keys. As you can imagine, I was floored by the perceived nonchalance these inanimate objects were just sitting there with, and instantly my thoughts turned to sleepwalking, downright forgetfulness, etc. But I knew in the back of my mind that none of these explained it. I went to grab them, and instantly dropped them because of the searing pain in my hand. They were hot, like metal baking trays straight out the oven hot, like they had been sitting under the sun on a corrugated metal roof all day in high summer heat. I made myself coffee, making sure not to touch them, and left them there all day and eventually picked them up and hung them on the hook next to the door, and didn't lose them again. Some other strange things that happened are as follows. I would sometimes hear a woman crying outside my window during winter, when there were no guests staying in the caravan or camping section of the park, which was in a different field anyway. Repeatedly, I'd wake up to find a suited man sitting on the end of my bed in the middle of the night. I'm not sure if it was a dream, but it never felt like one. Doors kept opening and closing that I knew were not opened or closed beforehand. Wardrobes being opened and things being dragged out of it while I was out of the room. This happened a lot, no matter how many things I stacked in there. The door on it was one of those that you had to push inward for it to release the catch and open outward, if you get what I mean. The TV would turn itself on and off, flickering lights and bulbs breaking way more than normal. Extra cold and hot spots throughout the building, which I often walked through or felt forming and disappearing next to me. I used to sleep with an electric blanket under my bottom sheet, and 2 or 3 blankets on top of me, and occasionally would wake up freezing, with 1 or 2 of the top layers on the other side of the bedroom. There was no way I could have kicked them that far in my sleep. Once I woke up with my bed a foot away from the wall. It was a divan bed with wheels. We are not in an area that experiences earthquakes or anything like that, so how did it move? I moved out when I was 17 and social services don't put kids there anymore due to some unrelated issues that I had with the landowner, which I am glad about in many respects. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask in the comments.
I grew up in a very paranormally active home in East Bethel, Minnesota in the mid-90s. As I mentioned in my previous post, this house had every type of ghost you could think of. We experienced all kinds of unexplained electrical malfunctions, like the dishwasher starting itself, despite not being used in years, radios playing and changing functions seemingly on their own, and broken lights suddenly turning on by themselves for no apparent reason. There were also times there would be knocking on the walls and explosive pounding on the front door, all without any plausible cause. This particular incident occurred in the summer of 1997. I was 5 years old and was just about to turn 6. My younger sister and I were sleeping in what was supposed to be our big girl bedroom. It was a previously unused room in the basement my mum had decorated for us in a ballerina Barbie theme when she was expecting our baby brother. She wanted the new baby's room to be close to hers, so we were evicted from our cozy bedroom upstairs to the cold and neglected basement. My mum had added some Barbie sticker decals to the walls and splurged on a queen-size Barbie comforter and pillow shams to make the uncomfortable room seem more exciting to a 4 and 5-year-old. For some reason, me and my sister were sharing a bed in this new room, even though we had our own beds when we were in the upstairs room. Despite all of my mum's efforts and the assurance of my sister's physical proximity, the downstairs room always made me anxious. I would beg my little sister to let us keep our small television on for comfort, but she hated that staticky feeling that emitted from the television, that she seemed ultra-sensitive to. One early morning, between 3:30 and 3:45 a.m., I woke up to an eruption of chaos happening around me. The first thing I became aware of was that my little 5-year-old body was bouncing up and down off the mattress without my control. I was laying on my back with my arms slightly out to my sides. My knees were bent, sticking up in the air with my feet flat on the mattress. My body was bouncing as if someone was quickly jumping up and down repeatedly on the mattress very close to me, towards my feet. The next thing I noticed was how dark the room was. It was always dark when the TV and all the lights were off, but this was different. It was so dark, I couldn't make out the outline of the door opening, less than 10 feet away from us. Meanwhile, the FM radio clock plugged in on the shelf above our heads was playing an unknown song at a volume that I felt like it was going to shatter our eardrums. This unknown melody pierced the dark room like an alarm, causing panic and confusion. My sister was in the bed, laying on her side facing me. She was not bouncing up and down like I was. She was shaking my arm and crying. She was begging and pleading for me to wake up and make everything stop. Without even taking a moment to think about how or why any of this was happening, I sprang up to my feet, and while standing on the bed, I pulled the power cord of the radio from the wall. Silence immediately enveloped the dark room and seemed to bring calm. At the time, I didn't know the song that the clock radio had been screaming out, but as I grew up, I would learn that it was the Police's 1980s hit, Every Breath You Take. It took me 15 years after this experience to appreciate how creepy that song was, especially in the context of this event, in a home plagued by invisible entities.
Every breath you take, every move you make, every step you take, I'll be watching you.
After I unplugged the radio, somehow my little sister was able to go right back to sleep without so much as a peep about what we had just experienced. I don't remember doing so, but I know I went to my parents' bedroom that night and laid down on the floor on my mum's side of the bed. I remember just laying there, wondering what I had just experienced.
Having so much history myself with the paranormal, I don't freak out over creaks in the floor or the occasional door shutting on its own. I believe most things can be explained. When we first moved into this house in Washington 3 years ago, we saw a few random orbs here and there, nothing that felt harmful. In fact, one orb even danced to the music alongside my granddaughter one day, and it felt like a child. The house sits on acres of field, surrounded by forest and a few farms. For some reason, the guest room, laundry room and bathroom are always freezing cold. Plus, cool air comes from the guest bedroom closet. I keep a blanket hanging up in the hallway door to keep the cold isolated. I figure those rooms are just cold because they are added on and are built halfway over our well. I have my mother's ashes in my home, but at the same time I felt bad because when I was asked if I wanted my sister's ashes later, it scared me for some reason. I don't know why. She was a very loving person, but for many years I felt darkness around her, and I just couldn't. A year passed, and that fear left me. I remember her telling me one day before she died that she had a recurring dream of her death, and she was stuck in the desert. It then dawned on me that her ashes were being cared for by my daughter who lives in the desert. It was time to let her be here with Mum. After she arrived, her ashes were placed next to our mother's ashes outside my room, and like my mother, she was surrounded by some of her mementos. At first, there wasn't a problem, but after time, that's when the kids started seeing and experiencing things that made them feel uncomfortable. It didn't feel like my sister. This was something else. Strangely, absolutely no one in the family has felt her presence since she passed. I know my kids looked towards me for assurance. I guess they thought that, like in other homes, I could just make it all go away. But I think they stayed hidden from me in the beginning and preyed on those who showed fear. So it was targeting my grown kids, that being my son and his fiancée. I felt bad. I kept telling my son that there was nothing here, and that our house wasn't haunted because we cleansed it after my sister passed away. Cody, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry for not wanting to believe you at the time. I was just trying to protect you and the kids from being scared. So there are a few things that have been happening in our home for the past few years. One late afternoon I was at the store, so my son and his fiancée were watching my 2 grandchildren for me. They were playing hide and seek. They told me something wasn't right in there. Each of them experienced what they said felt like someone or something taking up space within them in the closet, practically in their face. It had been a toy room in the beginning, but the kids wouldn't play in there. The only person who has ever slept there with no problem is my ex on a visit. He was a non-believer, until just the day when we were sitting in there watching a show together, and we observed his dog intently follow something move around the room. Then the bathroom door opened, and his dog watched whatever it was going to the bathroom, and the door shut behind it. At that point, his dog dove under the blanket. My ex's eyes were as big as saucers, and he asked me if I saw what he saw. Laughing inside at the former non-believer, I said yes. No one will ever sleep in there, not even me. 6 months ago, my son told me that he went into the kitchen to grab something to drink the night before, and he saw a dark shadow over his left shoulder in his reflection on the microwave. He turned around quickly to look behind him, and there was nothing there. He still felt something close to him, and the hair on his arm and neck were raised. So when he looked into his reflection this time in the window over the sink, and again, it was back, with its head even closer to his. Then the cabinet door shook back and forth, then opened all the way and shut. He said that he yelled, not caring if he woke anyone up, and ran upstairs to his room. I don't blame him. Many times he and his fiancée have seen big shadow masses in corners of various rooms, but never in my bedroom. Waiting outside my door, where my sister's ashes are, but never inside my room. There was a time not too long ago they were both sitting in my van talking one night, and they said the form of a man came out from behind a tree, crossed the grass, and sat with his hands in his lap on the front porch, and then faded away. Then they told me about the bathroom. Oh my, that bathroom. I can't even. His fiancée was taking a bath after everyone had gone to sleep, as to not disturb anyone. She was relaxing in our big old claw bathtub in the quiet of night, and she heard all of us sleeping, so she knew for a fact no one was up. There was a tapping on the bathroom door and she answered, to no response. The doorknob started to jiggle, then stopped, so she asked again, "Who is it? I'm in the tub." There was still no response. She thought that whoever it was decided to go to the other bathroom, so she relaxed, and she was laying there. But then something felt off, as she heard a noise at the door, and she watched as the doorknob slowly unlocked itself. When she told me that, my blood ran cold. This didn't just happen once. My son was sitting in there and he heard tapping, followed by the door unlocking on him too. The other day, my son said that he had gone to the bathroom around 3 in the morning. He knew everyone was asleep because he heard all of us snoring, so he didn't quite shut the door all the way, but it was closed. He heard heavy breathing as if someone had their mouth at the crack of the door. Then he heard a quiet voice whisper, "I can hear you." That poor boy was scared to death. I, for the first time, experienced the doorknob unlocking itself on me 3 times in a row in my bathroom last night. That surprised me. It has not always been bad experiences here though. Since my mother passed, I feel her sometimes around me. We all do. Just last month I was talking to my son in the living room, and I saw a light. We don't live near a street, so it wasn't from a car. It was soft and illuminating, as it floated from the front window curtain around to the wall behind my son. I got such a warm feeling and said, "Hey, Mama," and watched it as it went behind the recliner, where my son was sitting, and then up behind his head and disappeared. He didn't see this or know why I said that. Just then he shrugged his shoulders up and put his hands on the back of his head, saying that it felt like his hair was being stroked. That brought tears to both of us. We all know when she is here because it feels warm and loving, like her. And sometimes we smell her sweet perfume. My grandson, who is autistic, was too young to comprehend my mother's passing. He sometimes talks to her, almost like he is answering what seems to be a question. He is only 6 and has the purest soul. I wish I could hear her voice speak to me again. And then you have things that happen that at the time you didn't understand, but when you find out, everything falls into place. This was one such time. In March, I had a few aluminium balloons left over from my grandson's birthday, and they lasted a very long time. All of them fell to the floor except one particular balloon. It kept following me midway in the air around the house. The air conditioner nor heater was on, and all the windows were shut. I went to my bedroom, and it followed and stayed in my bed. I went into the laundry room, and it followed there as well. This went on for a solid week after a while. It just started getting annoying, but we didn't think anything of it. We just swatted it away. One day my son and I were talking in the kitchen, and it came in from the living room, where we just saw it laying on the floor moments before and lowered itself to go under the door frame and stopped mid-height between us. He took it and pushed it back into the living room. Not 4 minutes later, and it was back mid-height between us. This time he put it all the way in the laundry room, and it still made its way back, lowering to come through 2 door frames and staying afloat midway between us again. At that point it was too weird. We both looked at each other and said, "Nah." So I took it and said, okay, if this is you, Mum, do it again. I put it back in the living room and it stayed there floating. It didn't feel like her at the moment. It felt different, almost familiar, but not in a bad way. We went back to talking, and there it was again between us. Well, I didn't know this at the time. In fact, I only just found out a few weeks ago that my dear friend passed away in March and his family didn't have my number to tell me. One of the last things he told me was that when he dies he was going to come harass me just for fun and let me know that he's here and he loves me. When I found out, I called out to my son saying, "It was Tom! It was Tom after all." After I told him the sad news, he said that it gave him a bit of peace. We all knew that this is something he would do, and it blew our minds. I just wish I found out then, so that I could have told him that I love him too. 3 nights ago, I saw a light low to the ground in the kitchen, and 5 minutes later my granddaughter saw the same light, formed like a feather, fluttering in front of her. My son also told me that a light trailed up over and across in his room. Another time he walked into my room and saw a light above my head. My neighbor is confident something happened on this land. I talked to him to see if he had been experiencing or seeing anything unusual, without making myself look crazy. He said that he does not go out after dark, but he has heard the screams in the forest and his pets acting strangely from time to time. As we were talking, his roommate came home and asked me what we were talking about. When I told him, he pointed to the young man I was talking to first and said, "You see, I'm not nuts." Apparently, he had seen things as well, and called what he sees in his bedroom a demon boy, because he doesn't know what it is. He even saged in this room, and if you think about it, that goes along with the orb that danced with my granddaughter when we first moved in. And no, it's not a demon, I think that perhaps it's a child that connected or roams the property. We have seen so many beautiful things here that it outweighs the bad. Someday after I'm gone, I hope to be a part of it. I want to be the whisper of encouragement in my loved one's ears, and a gentle stroke upon their face. I want them to always know that they don't have to be afraid, and that they are, and always will be loved, from now until forever. As for what is in this house, I think since I have been more aware of the darkness, it shows itself less. I do enjoy feeling my loved ones around though, and my kids do too. Someday we will move from this place, and hopefully one of our loved ones will follow. Today, when I arrived home after running errands, my ex told me that without a doubt he saw something. At first I told him to stop playing around because I thought he was making fun of us. I've known this man for 24 years, so I know when he's serious. And this time he was definitely shaken. He said that he was standing in the guest room, and he was about to go into the bathroom to wash his hands, when someone tall, who he thought was my son, turned on the light and darted into the bathroom really fast, closing the door behind him. He waited for a bit, but didn't hear anything. He got tired of waiting, washed his hands in the kitchen, and still hadn't heard anything for a while. So we went to the door and asked if my son was okay, to not receive an answer, but the light was still on. He tentatively pushed open the door, to find nothing. Confused, he went to my son's room and knocked, and asked him why he did that and left the light on. But when my son came out of his room, he was wearing a burgundy shirt and pants. With a shake in his voice, my ex asked if he had changed his clothes, to which my son responds, "No, why?" The person my ex saw was wearing a blue t-shirt and shorts. My son told me that when he opened the door, my ex turned pale. On another occasion, my son's fiancée was in the kitchen today, and we are all putting away groceries. She has mid-length hair, and in front of everyone her hair flipped up like someone tossed it. It freaked her out, and she said it gave her shivers. I promised my other son I would come help paint his new place, so I bathed my grandkids and made them something to eat. I figured I would only be gone a few hours, but it took way longer than expected. When I arrived, there were all kinds of commotions going on in my room, and my grandson was crying uncontrollably. No one could understand him because he was so upset, so he was trying to act out what just happened. After I calmed him down, he told me that he was getting tired and laid down. He said something woke him up, and he heard my car, so he went towards the bedroom door, when a dark hole formed at the top, outside my door, and a dark shadow boy thing came out of it. He said the boy stood in the doorway and pushed him back and slammed the baby gate, trapping him in the room. He said it was evil. He kept saying that over and over, "He's evil." After the gate shut, my grandson screamed, so everyone in the house ran to see what was wrong. I know kids have active imaginations, but I know him. He's autistic, and he doesn't lie or make things up. He was visibly shaken up, and since last night, his story hasn't changed.
Okay, so these are my experiences of when I was growing up in a house so blatantly haunted. My friends only ever stayed over once. Might as well start with the daily occurrences. For context, the house was raised, so we had garage and basically storage under the living space at ground level, so no animals walking on the ground and making noise in the house stuff. So we had the footsteps walking down the hall when there was only me in the house, the pantry door being open every morning. Dad would be up at like 4 a.m. to get ready for work, and it would be open, so he'd close it and blamed it on me for some time. Okay, so on to the more wild stuff. I was hanging out with a mate of mine, and we made our way back to my place, and I realized I didn't have a key. so I asked him to just wait at the front door and I'd go to the back door. We never bothered to lock the back door because we had a neo-mastiff. So I went around back, walked up the stairs and opened the door into the kitchen, and directly in front of me was the T-intersecting hallway and a shadow projected onto the wall. So first, the sun was a solid 90 degrees to the side of where the shadow could be mine. Second, it was standing full height from the floor, and as I moved, it didn't. So I froze, and as my mind was processing what I was seeing, it turned and bolted towards the living room and front door. And yes, I both heard and felt the footfalls. So in that moment, my mind shifted from shadow to intruder, and I ran after it. I'm talking like 2 meters across the kitchen and about 3 to the living room. And I remember my friend was at the door waiting for me, so I just make for the door and realize there was nobody around. I opened the door and told my friend there might be someone hiding right here, so help me check. Nothing. Short one this time. Sitting at the computer around 1 or 2 a.m. Felt a hot breath blow across the back of my neck. Jumped out my skin with that one. I have 2 younger sisters and I was watching TV with one of them in the living room and decided I had enough and was going to bed. So I got up and said goodnight, started walking to my room, and at the end of the hall was a young girl in white PJs. And I just thought that it was the younger sister. And so I gave no more thought for about 3 more steps till I reached her doorway and she was sitting there playing a Naruto game on the old PS2. That's when I looked back up the hall and it was empty. I remember muttering, "Damn it, Bob," at this point. We had long since started calling the ghost Bob, just so we had something to call it. The fated friends night over, so not much happened for most of the night till we decided that it was bedtime. We were 19 at the time. Anyway, it was the following morning when I got up and went to the living room where my mate had slept, and he looked like hell. Our lights had an afterglow function so you could see for a few minutes after turning them off. Well, apparently, about an hour after I buggered off to go to bed, the lights clicked twice, and the blue glow clicked on, and that stirred him awake, thinking one of us was up. Then, the front door started rattling on the frame like someone was outside, pushing and pulling it. That eventually stopped, and not long after, he heard the footsteps going from the door down the hall and back for some time. He said he pulled the blanket up over his head when the door started banging, and wasn't game enough to pull it down to see what was walking around. He flatly refused to stay a single night ever again in that house. This is just a snapshot of the shenanigans that we experienced in that house, but they are also the most memorable. When I was 13 to 14, me and my friends would sneak out and go hang out with our boyfriends out in the middle of nowhere. We lived basically in the middle of nowhere, so going to random back roads was pretty much our only option for having fun. We would go to this place the locals called the Tunnel. It was just a dirt road with tall trees and overgrown willows on both sides. It was very secluded, so we would go there to drink beer, smoke weed, and make out with our boyfriends. They'd always tell us spooky stories of a large black dog that would chase their car every time they went down there at night. They said one time they went there during the day and they saw the dog dead and mangled on the side of the road. The next time they went back at night, the black dog was alive and well and chasing after their car again. I knew they were just telling us these stories to scare us, and I wasn't sure if I really believed them, since I came down to this place with them a few times and had never seen the black dog. One night, around 1 or 2 in the morning, we were all sitting in our friend's car in the tunnel. We had all been drinking and smoking weed. We were all joking and laughing when suddenly the driver whispers, "What is that up there?" I looked and didn't see anything, so I replied, "There's nothing up there. Your eyes are playing tricks on you." "No, seriously, there's something in the road up there," he replies. The guy sitting in the passenger seat agrees and says he sees something too. The driver puts the car in drive and starts slowly rolling forwards, and a figure emerges from the dark. A man in shorts is standing in the middle of the road watching us drive towards him. This is a dirt road in the middle of nowhere at 2 a.m. on a very cold fall night, and this man is standing in the road wearing nothing but shorts, not even shoes on, just shorts. "What the hell is he doing?" the driver says as he pushes on the brakes and stops the car. We all stare for a moment at this man just staring at us. His eyes were glowing, like a deer's eyes do in the headlights. I've never seen a person's eyes glow like that before. We all start freaking out, and then the driver says, "Forget this," and starts driving forward, fast. The man just keeps staring at us until we get about 10 feet away, and then he just calmly walks to the side of the road and vanishes. There was nowhere for him to go. There were 6-foot-tall fences with willows overgrown over the fence, making the barrier at least 10 feet tall. No human man could have cleared all of that. I still can't explain it to this day. This happened about 5 years ago when I was a high school student. It was summer, and a friend of mine from an after-school club came up to me and said, "Hey, I heard from one of the guys about this place that is supposed to be haunted. Everyone's going to go later. Are you in?" Hell yes, I was in. I love anything spooky at that age. So that night at about 7 o'clock, we headed to the location. There were 9 of us in total. We all went to the same club and often hung out together. We were heading to the middle of nowhere. There were nothing but flatlands and fields as wide as the eye could see. It was going to be developed on a new bunch of houses that were planned there. I was like, "Where the hell are we going, guys?" And someone replied, "To the park." I started to doubt the existence of a park in this desolate area, but we found it after a few more fields. It was completely run down, and I bet that it was hardly ever used. All you could hear was the insects of the night. It was weird to see the empty fields and the partially level grounds all around, and then a park smack bang in the middle. It was a little spooky. There was no reason why it shouldn't have been leveled for the planned construction. Once we got there, my friend started to tell us about the alleged haunting. He said that the swing in this park swings by itself, even on days when the wind doesn't blow. I expected it to slightly sway in the wind, but it was like it was being violently thrown around in anger by some unseen force. It was amazing. I didn't expect to see anything like that. I thought that it must be a trick or something. I thought one of the other guys was pulling some fishing line or something. I looked over, and they were all as shocked as I was. I carefully looked at their hands and legs to see if they were moving with the same rhythm as the swing, but they weren't. One of my friends said, "Let's take a video," and went to pull his phone out of his pocket. He aimed his phone at the swing, and then something really weird happened. The moment he pointed it at the swing, his phone went flying as if someone had slapped it out of his hand. We stood there completely dumbstruck. If any of my friends were planning this prank, they might have just smashed a phone. I realized that it wasn't a prank. It was real. Everyone looked completely shocked. My friend stooped to pick up his phone in silence. Then we heard a terrible scream. We just bolted out of there. The screams only seemed to get louder and louder the further away we got from the park. These voiceless screams followed us for about 5 minutes, I swear. We burst into a nearby convenience store to take refuge from what just happened. The store was busy and it served as a welcome distraction. We bought some drinks to calm down. The friend who told us the rumor looked the most worried. He said he wasn't even sure we went to the right park. It was all a confusing mess. During that summer, everyone talked about the park. All the kids at school wanted to go there, and myself and my friends went back a couple of times, to be honest. Nothing else really happened, and everyone thought that the rumors died down. One thing you might find interesting is that a couple of years after graduating, I ran into one of the friends who was there that day. It was the guy whose phone got smacked out of his hand. He said that when we were running away, he looked back, and I guess he was the only one who did because no one else mentioned this. He said he saw a person with long limbs, like a stick insect. He said that it was chasing us, and it seemed like it was almost dancing, teetering, turning and twisting, almost falling. The image of the person with long spindly legs really sends shivers up my spine. I am kind of glad I didn't see it. When I was 15, me and my friends were driving around, going to all the haunted places around the Uinta Basin. It was getting close to Halloween, so, as is tradition, we were all trying to scare each other. First, we went to a place called the Haunted Woods. This is an actual business, not a place in the woods. Then we went to an abandoned hotel near the Ute Reservation. Nothing of significance happened there. We didn't see or hear anything, and we were just goofing around and having fun. Then the driver says we were going to Skinwalker Ranch. I'd never heard of Skinwalker Ranch, but I'd heard plenty of stories of skinwalkers. I was intrigued at first, but as we dropped down the hill, back behind the property, a feeling of total dread settled on me like a heavy blanket. Everyone in the car got more and more quiet, like they were feeling the heaviness too. I don't think we should be here, I spoke softly. Oh, we're going, the driver announced. There's no moon tonight, and no flashlights allowed, he continued. I will just stay in the truck then. I have a really bad feeling, and I don't want to go, I spoke again. You aren't staying in my truck alone. Now get out, he said rudely. I got out of the truck and looked over at my best friend. Her face was white and her eyes were wide and round, and I knew she felt the same way that I did. We shouldn't be here. The driver of the truck said that this was the back end of the huge ranch. I wouldn't have believed him that this was really Skinwalker Ranch if I didn't feel that it was in every nerve ending of my body. He walked over to an ancient post and pole fence, undid the loop of wire holding up a small gate, and laid it on the ground. There was an overgrown 2-track road leading up into the darkness, and we followed as he led us up it. The horrible feeling of dread was almost overwhelming, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I wanted to go running back to the truck, but I had a deep fear that something would pounce the moment I left the safety of the group. We weren't laughing and joking here. That heaviness was weighing on all of us, and we walked silently through the dark. As we walked, I tried to keep my eyes on my feet, but would occasionally glance to either side of the 2-track road. Each time I did, I would see a huge black mass out in the tall grass. I told myself it was just a cow, but each time I looked, it was in the same spot off to the left, following our journey to the old homestead. Finally, the driver and leader of our foolish expedition stopped and said that we were almost to the old homestead, that we needed to stay quiet in case the owners were around. As he turned to start walking again, a growl leapt from the darkness, and he stopped and took a step back. He wasn't our fearless leader anymore. His voice shook as he told us it was time to head back to the truck. We walked a little ways back, and then one of our group said they needed to use the bathroom. We stopped by a small stream running along the south end of the property. I was smoking and talking to one of my friends about how relieved I was that we were leaving. I glanced down at the stream at the same time my friend did, just in time to see a black figure emerging from the water. It was not a cow. It was not a coyote. It looked like a too skinny and too tall man. We both screamed and ran back to the road. That was the last straw for everyone, and we all ran the entire way back to the truck. Now, I know that is eerie, but kind of uneventful. Have no fear. My story isn't over yet. A few months later, this adventure had slowly left my mind. I had started to convince myself that the figures in the darkness were just cows, and that it probably was just the dark running water playing tricks on my eyes, making me see things emerging from the water that weren't really there. My best friend had come over to my house to sit outside, bullshit and smoke cigarettes. We did this pretty frequently. Like I said in my last story, we lived in the middle of nowhere, so dumb things like this were about as much fun as we could have. So we are sitting in her car, just across the road from my house. Her car is pointed towards the town park, which was about a block away. There are no other houses on the way to the park, so with the street lamps on at the park, you can basically see everything up there. "Oh, look, a deer," my friend says suddenly. I could see a set of glowing eyes on the very far end of the park. "Oh, yep, there it is," I reply. We watch it as it slowly walks towards the center of the park. In this spot is a huge metal slide/jungle gym thing that is probably 10 to 12 feet tall. As the deer is walking, I notice that for some reason, I can't make out any features of the deer. It seems to always be just out of reach of the street lamps that are dotted throughout the park. The deer is right next to the slide when, suddenly, it stands up. The eyes that we were watching are suddenly even with the platform of the slide, which would make this deer 10 to 12 feet tall. Then, it starts to walk, standing on its hind legs. Me and my friend both started panicking. What the hell is it? That's not a deer. We keep watching this extremely tall creature across the park when my friend decided we're driving up there. She locks the doors and we head towards the park. When we were almost there, the eyes had crossed the street and went into the neighborhood across from the park. By the time we got there, whatever it was had vanished. Another few months go by. The event had definitely rattled us, and there was no convincing ourselves that it was a deer. Deer do not walk on their hind legs, and they are not 10 feet tall. One night, I'm at the same friend's house. This friend lives smack dab in the middle of a huge farmland. All around her were pastures. It was very peaceful most of the time. We spent the night watching movies and hanging out. I went and started my car, and we were smoking together on her porch before I left. We were just chatting when suddenly her eyes leave my face and look behind me, and her eyes grow wide. I turned to look to see two glowing red eyes just past the fence into her neighbor's pasture. "What the hell is that?" I managed to squeak out. "I don't know," she whispers back. The eyes remained fixed on us for about 30 seconds, then turned to the left, blinked, and vanished. We both ran back to the house. I didn't dare go home for another 45 minutes. If my car hadn't already started, I probably wouldn't have left at all. A couple of years after these events, I was speaking with an Ute tribal member that I worked with, and she said something that gives me goosebumps to this day. She told me, it isn't what's on the ranch that you should be afraid of. It's what follows you when you leave. I'm convinced that something followed us from Skinwalker Ranch, and those terrifying events were something warning us to never go back. I never did, and I never will. This happened about 10 years ago when I was working in a rural area. My work colleagues and I were staying in a kind of hostel or dormitory at the time, right in the middle of nowhere. I mean, literally. You open the front door of the hostel, and there is absolutely no sign of life out there. It was a purpose-built building for us workers to stay in, to oversee the work we had in that area. In the daytime, the place is busy and lively, but at night, it's eerily quiet. It's just so dark out there. It always felt like something was watching me at night, and it didn't like me. There were a couple of streetlights, but nothing much else. As an adult man, I was freaked out to take a walk by myself at night. There were no shops around, nothing to do. It really was in the middle of nowhere. All we could do was sit indoors and get drunk, which wasn't all that bad. This story takes place one night when we were drinking. We were in good spirits since it was a Friday, and it was a late one. Whenever we do these late drinking nights, I usually get some water before heading to bed to sober up. With being too drunk to drive, I had to go to the vending machine up the road a little. I didn't really want to go alone. Something about being out there really creeped me out. So I asked a colleague if he wanted to go with me. Thankfully, he said he wanted to, and we set off on a short walk to the vending machine. I felt great. The night air was sobering me up a little, and I was chatting with my coworker. We arrived at the vending machine. My colleague went ahead of me and got a drink. He cracked it open and started staring off into the distance. "What the hell is that?" I heard him say as I was inserting coins into the machine. I scanned the dark horizon. There was nothing but trees swaying in the breeze and a few distant rice fields. The night air was full of various chirps of insects and croaks of bullfrogs. Nothing but darkness. I didn't know what my friend was talking about.
Hey,
A voice called from the darkness. My blood ran ice cold. My eyes widened, and in a panic, I tried to find the owner of that voice, but I couldn't.
hey, hey.
It was slightly louder now. Shivers ran up my spine. Someone else was out here with us. I looked over at my friend, and I followed his eyeline. And that's when I saw it. There was someone out there. I mean, it looked human. It looked to be male too. Something was off though. Its head was bigger than a normal human, and it looked to be on stilts because it was massive. It was clad in black, but had a bone-white face. The huge, hulking figure just stood motionlessly staring at us, about 200 meters away from the vending machine. I couldn't say a word. I just stared in horror. Then, my friend bolted. I had to run after him. Thankfully, we didn't have too far to run. Of course, all our colleagues didn't believe our crazy story when we got back, but there were some looks towards the window, checks of the locks, and none of them offered to go outside in search of what we had seen. I cannot 100% say if that thing was a human. It was the most disturbing thing I've ever seen in my life, and that moment has haunted me for years. I have no idea what it wanted, but I think that if my friend and I didn't react in time, we might not be here today. There are things out there we have no idea about. This is a story of when I went on a family trip to my uncle's pig farm. He lives in Niigata. My uncle lives really far from my parents' home. He lives alone on the farm, deep in the mountains in the middle of nowhere. I was about 7 years old. It all happened on a day in the middle of summer. I was with my cousins, 4 children and 2 adults. We had just to wait at work until everyone was done. We were getting in the way. I can't remember the reason why we went there. I think we went to visit him, to get some wild vegetables in the mountains. I'd been sat in the car for 2 hours. We lived by the sea. The car rocked and shook the whole journey. Finally, we reached the pig farm. It stunk to high heaven. My family had said that it was deep in the mountains. When I got there, it was much further in the middle of the mountains than I imagined. I guess if you're used to it, it's probably nice. But to me, a person who had never been to a pig farm, honestly, it was painful. So the adults went looking for these wild vegetables, and us kids went off to play. Just a little down the fill from the pig farm, there was a wide, empty, vacant plot of land. We played tag there. We were all about the same age. We eventually got bored of playing tag, so we wanted to do something else. We had enough of where we were. I think it was one of my cousins who absent-mindedly suggested, let's look around. We all agreed to explore the area. We got permission from our parents and off we went. We started by looking around the perimeter of where we were. We soon found a sign that read, "Do not enter." It hung on a rope. Beyond it, a path into the forest. As a child, when you come across a sign which reads, "Do not enter," it means, please enter. It fans the flames of your sense of curiosity. Naturally, we climbed over the rope and entered the path to the forest. It wasn't a pavemented path, but surprisingly, a well-maintained woodland path. There were several warehouse buildings. I had never seen anything like this in my hometown. The buildings were all derelict. I felt a sense of pity. We continued walking for a little while, and then we saw some people ahead of us, walking as well. When I think back to it, it is strange that there were people walking along that road, especially since the sign said, "Do not enter." But at the time, I didn't care in the slightest. As we got closer to them, I saw that one was wearing a straw hat and was carrying a hoe in his hand. He had a towel wrapped around his neck. He was wearing big leather boots as well. He looked like your typical farmer. He looked old enough, 70 or even 80 maybe. He noticed we were approaching and stopped and said in his countryside accent, "What are you doing in here?" I couldn't understand what he was saying. My cousin translated for us. Before any of us could answer, he asked, "You here to catch some bugs?" Because we didn't have a better answer, we just looked at each other and nodded. "If you keep going, it's even better." He said something like that. We carried on walking along the path. "Scary," I muttered to my cousin. He looked creeped out too. We saw the occasional farming machine as we walked, tractors, etc. I don't know why we didn't turn back. I guess we were fueled by curiosity. We saw the figure of a person up ahead. He had a straw hat on, leather boots, a towel around his neck, and he was holding a hoe. "What are you doing in here?" "What?" I thought. "You here to catch some bugs?" he said before he said anything.
If you keep going, it's even better.
It was exactly the same. A repeat. I don't know if the others realized at the time. It was so weird. This time, I didn't say scary. Since no one said anything, I thought it might be my mind playing tricks on me. The rest of the group started to walk, and I said, maybe we should go back soon. My cousin said, "We haven't found anything. Why would we go back?" The others agreed with him. I reluctantly followed them deeper down that forest trail. We came across the same factory buildings, farming machines, tractors. "Hey, we've been here before. Are we lost?" I asked. "We've been walking on one road in one direction. How can we be lost?" They sensed something strange was happening now. Even at this point, our curiosity was greater than our sense of fear. We hadn't had any experiences with danger. We didn't know true fear at that age. There he was again, the man in the straw hat. I couldn't stand anymore. I ran for it. "Hey!" my cousins shouted. They pulled at my shirt. They asked why I was running. I didn't answer. I just wanted to get away. Before too long, I was back at the rope we all climbed over. I ran to my parents. Maybe I was crying, I can't remember. I told everyone what had happened. They looked at me suspiciously. Everyone laughed at my story and said there is no such thing. Except my uncle. He approached me later that evening and asked, "Did you step over the rope? Did you go into the do not enter place?" I nodded. "Did you get stuck in a loop?" He began to speak in detail. It seems like the no entry place's forest road is home to bears, wild boars and other dangerous animals. Hunters are allowed to enter with permission, but that is extremely rare. A lumber supply company used to use the road to get to the factories. It was used by tradesmen as well. That's why it was so well maintained. He seemed to think something was trying to pull us closer into the woods, trying to bewitch or trick us. He said something could have taken the form of the man. He said he would not go further than we did. I wondered why I was the only one who noticed the weird loop. I didn't want to ask at the time. Whatever that man was, he was trying to keep us lost in there. This occurred to me and my then girlfriend in the summer of 2004. I need to provide a bit of context first though, so the context will be the first little bit. My hometown was decimated by flooding from Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Part of the response and recovery efforts involved FEMA setting up RVs as temporary housing for those whose homes were either destroyed or heavily damaged. These RVs were set up in a previously vacant field outside of town. The park was dismantled by 2001 or so. They put up fencing around the perimeter and trenched over the other streets into the area to keep people out. But they forgot one entrance, or left it purposely open for emergency vehicles to have access. Some friends of mine had found this entrance, and we frequently used the area as our playground. We would go back there to set off fireworks, turn the streets into a race course, and to have sex with our girlfriends. To set the stage of how this place looks, there were 3 streets running east-west orientation, a street that went around the other streets in an oval fashion. The grass was very overgrown and about 4 feet high. The south and north side of the area was wooded. The east side had large dirt berms that were about 20 feet high and had been placed there when the site was graded in 1999. They normally provided a climbing challenge for our SUVs. This particular day, my girlfriend and I were parked on one of the east-west streets along the tall grass to remain hidden. We got undressed to have sex in the back seat of the car. As we began, I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. I turned to look, and there is a man coming over the 20-foot-high dirt berm. He's wearing denim overalls, and in his left hand is a full-size axe. A wave of fear washed over me, and I yelled out, "Oh my God." My girlfriend pops up to look out the back windshield and let out a scream and what are we going to do? I frantically start looking for the car keys. There is a pile of clothes on the floorboard and I can't find them. I look out the back and he's getting closer. I can see his face now and it's emotionless with a blank stare. I start grabbing clothes and shaking them to hopefully find the keys. They pop loose and fall to the floor. I grab them and immediately jump into the driver's seat, still completely naked. I start the car, and from the back seat my still naked girlfriend screams, "Go." I look in the rearview mirror as I'm putting the car into drive, and he's now within about 50 to 60 feet of the car. Same blank look, but staring at the car with the axe still in hand. I didn't even fasten my seatbelt, and I'm still fully nude as I floored the gas, kicking up rocks everywhere as the tires spun, as I sped away from this man holding the axe. We got out of the abandoned FEMA park as quickly as I could drive the car without crashing. My girlfriend was hysterical the whole time until we got back to the main road and were safe. We stopped about a mile up the road, on the side, to put our clothes back on and de-stress. I don't know where this man came from, as there are no houses within a mile or so of the old FEMA site. He seemingly came out of nowhere. I also did not see any cars at the site, as I had done a lap around the park before we chose our spot to park. I'm not sure what his intentions were, as he never said anything to us, and I know he saw us panicking in the car. Whatever his intentions were, I know they weren't good. The look on his face and the axe in his hand made that abundantly clear. I went back with a few friends a couple of days later and found no place this guy could have been lurking, and there were no signs anyone had been camping there. To this day, it's one of the scariest events I've ever been through. Whoever the Axeman was and whatever he was planning, let's not meet.